My father, Winton Dean, paid his first visit to Hambledon in 1916, when he was 6 weeks old, and died here nearly 98 years later. His grandparents, Tommy and Florrie van Gryzen, there they are, who lived in Birkenhead, had taken a charming cottage on the green for the summer to be near Florrie's sister Essie, who had a house in Sandhills. It was a sad year for them. A few months later, their son Wilfrid, the most gifted of the family, died of wounds received at the Battle of the Somme. The cottage was built in 1895 by two literary spinsters, Edith Sitchell and Emily Ritchie, in a field purchased from the lord of the manor. This is Edith Sitchell. They named it Hambledon Hurst, after the wood. They set up a home for foundling girls from London in a cottage on Beech Hill. The girls went to the village school and were trained to become domestic servants. One of them, Lottie Hope, became housemaid to Virginia Woolf and later to her sister Vanessa Bell. Here is the cottage in the summer of 1918, before the extension, with my father's Aunt Ruby in the foreground. She lived to be 102 and a half. Another photo of the same date shows my father, aged 2 and a bit, with his mother Esther and grandmother Florrie on the veranda. The cottage had a number of disadvantages. Water was hauled from a well, and there was no bathroom. My father remembered being bathed in a tin tub in the back parlour. For years, it was without electricity. Light was supplied by oil lamps and candles. When a telephone was eventually installed, it was placed in the cloakroom for the maid to answer. Tommy and Florrie fell in love with the cottage and rented it again in the summer of 1917. They bought it the following year. Edith Sitchell died in 1914. 4 years later, Miss Ritchie published a charming collection of her letters, which mentioned visits to Hambledon by the pianist Fanny Davis, Ellen Terry, the actress, and the art critic Roger Fry, among others. Emily Ritchie was a near relative of the novelist W.M. Thackeray, author of Vanity Fair. The house was full of his drawings and caricatures, which unfortunately she took away. But it still contains part of an old dinner service dating from her time and a single-handed grandfather clock. The garden was small and full of flowers. There was a little sunken rose garden, subsequently buried when the cottage was enlarged in 1919. My father remembered the old gardener, Denyer, who seemed to belong to the remote past, and the grim housekeeper, Mrs. Telford, clumping up the back stairs and unwinding a long bandage from her rheumatic leg. The alterations, which doubled the size of the house and added a garage, were entrusted to the arts and crafts architect C.F.A. Voisey, who also designed furniture for the new bedrooms and the cloakroom. At the back, a bathroom was accommodated in a tower surrounded by battlements. Voisey favoured rush matting and green and orange carpeting. He had worked for the family before at Studland and Birkenhead. Since Tommy and Florrie intended to spend only the summers there, and those first summers were very hot, they had the entire ground floor of the new part of the house laid out as a single room, with tiny windows high up in the south wall. and heavy oak beams for a ceiling. It made a cool room in hot weather, but when in 1939 they gave up their London flat and moved permanently to Hambledon, it proved a white elephant, especially as the open fireplace, intended more for appearance than use, smoked abominably. Voysey had a number of fads. Bathroom doors secured not by keys or bolts, but by wooden wedges on a leather string. Lavatories flushed by pull-up handles at the side, set in hollows that proved a trap for spiders, and ventilators high in the walls of the bedrooms that clattered in the wind and frightened my father as a child. Voysey was at the height of his success in the first years of the century, but after the Great War, his practice declined. He designed later houses, but Hambledon Hurst was one of the last actually to be built. The garden was greatly enlarged in 1919, taking in 2 adjacent fields. For a whole summer, it was a muddy wilderness full of workmen maneuvering wheelbarrows precariously over planks. One of the fields was devoted largely to fruit and vegetables, with a tool shed and a greenhouse, which had to be concealed behind a clump of laurels because Tommy objected to such utilitarian features being visible from the house. The other field, in due course, contained a rock garden, here tended by Florrie, with the family's wire-haired terrier, Tiger, a rose garden, a grass tennis court, a bowling green surrounded by a yew hedge, a small pond full of water lilies, a dell, and a grove of nut trees, most of them on different levels, which made the garden seem larger than it really was. The pond was stocked with goldfish until they caught the eye of a passing heron. Florrie was a keen gardener, caring lovingly for the rock and rose gardens. Winton could not remember Tommy doing much in the garden, except stab dandelions in the lawns with a pointed implement. He seems a ghostly presence in this hand-coloured slide of the rose garden in 1926. When he was 2.5, Winton was looked after by a very pretty nurse named Dickie Mills. She took him round to Tigbourne Court, the Lutchins' house at the crossroads, then owned by the Wethered family, who were well-known amateur golfers. There was a lily pond in the garden. The gardener, Albert Jeffrey, pointed to goldfish and tadpoles swimming near the surface and caught a tadpole in his hands. Winton tried to do the same and tumbled in. Mr. Jeffrey quickly pulled him out, and Winton was conveyed home by Dickie in a little red cart with his initials WBD painted on the side, and his clothes were spread out on the lawn to dry. The delightful Dickie's arrival caused a stir in the village. According to my father many years later, all the red-blooded males in Hambledon pursued her. Then something went wrong. Soon afterwards, she was replaced by a temporary German nanny, the elderly Amelia Becker, whom my father detested. Winton and his mother were invited to tea at the rectory, now Glebe House. The rector, Canon Seymour, was a delightful man. He had been in the Falkland Islands at the time of the naval engagement there in 1914. During tea, Winton upset some crumbs on the rector's carpet and was sternly admonished by his mother to pick them up. Later, Canon Seymour too spilled some crumbs, and Winton piped, "You must pick them up!" He at once knelt down and did so. Winton's brother Martin was born on 18th March 1920, 4 years to the day after Winton. "Gosh, what a technique," a family friend commented. His brother Joe, a year, a month, a week, and a day later. Here are the three brothers at the Hurst in 1925. Joe, Martin, and Winton. The boys, who lived in London, enjoyed their holidays at Hambledon with their grandparents. Often the house was full with weekend guests, and the brothers and their new nurse, Harrico, had to sleep elsewhere. In 1921, their mother took Hawthorne Cottage in the woods near the cricket green. Like many village houses at the time, the cottage had no indoor sanitation, only an earth closet in the garden set over a ditch, which attracted a congregation of rats. My 5-year-old father was given a stick to frighten off the rats by banging on the door. Here he is with Rudge on the rockery steps at the Hurst. There was a major crisis that year when Martin disappeared. He was barely 18 months old, and a search party was hastily organized. He was not in the garden or down the well. Eventually, he was discovered on the common outside the gate, happily browsing off a blackberry bush. Blackberries caused a genuine casualty in 1921. The boys were busy collecting them in paper bags from a hedge when the housemaid Margaret trod on a wasp's nest. She let out a piercing scream, threw down her bag, and ran about in all directions. The village was roused, and a call went out for a blue bag, a laundry whitener thought to be good for stings. Margaret was treated and put to bed. Here are Joe, Harrico, Margaret, and Martin at the seaside some years later. Joe, Harrico, Margaret, and Martin. In subsequent years, they shared 2 bedrooms at Malthouse Farm, just beyond the top of the garden. At first, it was occupied by a retired naval man named Hawkins, with a parrot whose salty language the boys were discouraged from imitating. He was succeeded after a year or two by Arthur Ashdown, a builder whom Tommy engaged as a bailiff when later he bought the manor. Tommy had already acquired Malthouse Farm and other local houses, including Chart Cottage next to the shop. Ashdown had lived previously at Biffin's in Lane End, a house he built himself. His wife ran a dairy business. A nephew and niece did the milking and distribution, clip-clopping around the village on a horse-drawn milk float. Before the Great War, Ashdown was once fined for watering the milk. Later, he kept a few cows, sheep, and chickens in the field at Malthouse Farm with an ancient walnut tree in the middle. In the early summer, the meadow was dreamy with wild flowers and butterflies and the stridulation of innumerable grasshoppers. Martin was responsible for a few alarms and excursions, walking in his sleep one night and on another occasion tumbling downstairs while blowing a wooden whistle and cutting his lip. The boys paid regular visits to Mrs. Cumber's little shop on Beach Hill for sweets. Winton's grandmother, Florrie, kept hens, and he liked to assist her in retrieving the eggs. She had a favourite brown hen named Fanny, who, however, was a little temperamental. For many years, Florrie also kept bees. The hives were set out in the orchard under 3 lime trees. Winton watched from a safe distance as, hooded and gowned, puffing her smoker, Florrie operated on the hives and levered out the combs. Winton remembered the humming of the bees in the lime trees and the dripping, sticky honeydew secreted by aphids. Florrie produced lime honey, which Winton loved, and later in the summer, dark, tangy honey from heather on the common. For much of the 19th century, the Mellishes had been lords of the manor of Hambledon. They were a numerous family, with a hereditary solicitor's business in Godalming. In the early 1920s, the large house Woodlands, at the bottom of Woodlands Road, was inhabited by 3 Mellish sisters and 2 brothers, all unmarried. Another sister ran away with a man and got married. She was kept rather dark. After the Headleys bought Woodlands in 1934, they changed the name to Hambledon House, causing confusion with Hambledon Hurst ever since. The surviving Mellishes moved to Matteries, off Woodlands Road, another large house since demolished. Across the lane, where Springfields now stands, was an ugly pink and white wooden stables, long disused. That is the stables. Woodlands. Goodbrook House, at the top of the Hurst, was occupied by 2 elderly unmarried sisters, the Mrs. McClelland, always known as Tootsie and Mumps. Tootsie was thin and active, her sister stout and sedentary. Admer's cottage, opposite the village shop, was formerly called Snowdrop Bank. Snowdrops can still be found along the boundary. In those days, Miss Droop lived there. The shop was in the hands of a couple named Withy. They lacked enterprise, according to my father, who described Mr. Withy as a small, weedy man who talked as if he had a mouth full of gobstoppers. It was almost a parody of a village shop with a very limited range of goods. During the war, the Edwards family took over. Mr. Edwards was a voluble, breezy fellow who wore a buff-coloured coat. Winton first encountered Albert Jeffrey Sr. when he fished him out of the lily pond at Tigbourne Court. He lived with his busy wife in tiny Rose Cottage on the cricket green. Here they brought up 4 sons, Bert, Ted, Vic and Ernie, and a daughter, Elsie. The photo shows Tom Hammond, Elsie, Ernie, Albert, Vic, and Ted. All 4 brothers became gardeners and all played cricket for Hambledon. Ernie, Vic, Ted, and Bert. Elsie married Tom Hammond, who opened the batting for the first 11 for many years and later became a scrupulous secretary to the club. Bert, a very fine bowler, captained the first 11 from 1929 to 32, and when he finally retired, became an umpire and groundsman. His batting, usually at number 11, conformed to the recognized pattern of village cricket. He had only 2 strokes, a dead bat and an almighty heave, which, depending on the angle of contact, would send the ball anywhere, sometimes for 6 over the slips of third man. Both methods on occasion won matches for Hambledon. Bert and Ernie were employed in the garden at Hambledon Hurst all their working lives. Bert spoke a good deal about his experiences in France during the last year of the Great War. He'd had a rough time, he told Winton, from which he characteristically derived much humour and no bitterness. But according to Fanny, they still sometimes caused him to cry out in his sleep. Here is Bert in the garden at Hambledon during one of the devastatingly bleak winters of the early 1960s. As a boy, Bert assisted in the bakery at the village shop. He had an old photo showing cattle standing in the pond and a flock of geese. The baker's horse was watered there every day after the morning bread round, and horses were brought from Lower Farm and Malthouse Farm. One of Bert's duties in the garden was to look after the chickens. Asked to explain why he only took 1 of 2 eggs laid by a hen in the woodshed, he replied, "If I leaves one, he lays another. Why he?" We always call them he. His world was rich in personification. About the only thing Winton heard him refer to in the neuter was his mother's old car. Bert particularly enjoyed digging drains. Since the garden, being partly on clay, was liable to flooding, this proved useful. Ted Jeffrey moved to Oakhurst Cottage on his late marriage. Each day he would cycle to Hyde Stile, where, as well as toiling in the garden, he acted as chauffeur to the owner, Harry Moss of Moss Bros. Harry was a good cricketer and played for the village team. In about 1925, Winton's grandfather Tommy employed Arthur Ashdown from Malthouse Farm to build a pair of cottages, red roofs, on the bank the other side of the lane. Here is Mr. Ashdown in the veg patch at Malthouse with red roofs behind. The cottages were intended as staff accommodation. It was not then considered necessary to include a bathroom or an inside toilet. At first, number 1 was rented to a silent dentist named Leonard Martin and his exuberant wife, Maudie. They had a Pekingese called Mr. Was. From time to time, other colourful characters lodged with them, such as Ida Moon and Biddy Derrick. Miss Derrick had served in the forces during the war, sported a cigarette holder, and dressed in male attire. They all came to cheerful tennis parties at the Hurst. After his marriage, Bert Jeffrey moved to number 1. Here he is in his garden overlooking Malthouse Farm. And outside his front door with Fanny and Bonzo. At Red Roofs, they lived next to a happy family of pigs and chickens. There was a field above the cottages in those days, not a beech wood. The second cottage was intended for Tommy's chauffeur, first Hunt, who started his working life as a coachman in Birkenhead, then Monk. Both had families. Monk was almost as deaf as Tommy himself. Tommy sometimes deployed an ear trumpet, which he stuck to his ear while he was speaking, but removed when straining to catch the reply. At other times, he wore a species of headphone. Once at a banquet, his replies seemed more than usually inconsequent. It turned out that the device was tuned to the conversations on the table behind. Here is Tommy with Tiger at Hambledon in 1934. As a small boy, Winton was fascinated by cricket and followed the fortunes of the village team. From about 1921, Hambledon played an 11 from Watney's brewery, for which Mrs. Watney, who lived at Merville Hill, the house is now part of St. Dominic's School, presented a silver cup. Sometimes Winton watched with his grandmother's maid Annie, who was keen on cricket, or possibly on one of the cricketers. The overseer of the workhouse, Davenport, played for Hambledon, and some of the old inmates attended, sitting on a bench in front of the pavilion. In the early days, a man named Bignell or Bicknell was wicketkeeper. He wore brown pads. He was a bit of a rogue. He used to cheat, according to Bert Jeffrey. He'd stand close to the wicket, nudge the stumps with his pads and shout, "Well bowled!" Alf Goad, who toiled in his cobbler's shop on the path up from the cricket green stores, was first 11 scorer before and after the war. Later he served as parish clerk and verger at Hambledon Church. From 1934, Winton began to play regularly for Hambledon. It was a genuine village team consisting almost entirely of gardeners and workers from the Nutbourne brickworks, with a carpenter and an electrician, Sid Marsh, who was the captain. All lived in the village. Here is the Hambledon 12 against Rotherhithe in August 1934. That is 18-year-old Winton, my father. That's Sid Marsh. That's Bert Jeffrey with Tiger, the mascot. One of Hambledon's keenest fixtures was against Fethercombe, a country house 11 named after the residence of Eric Parker, the naturalist and writer on sporting and country themes, who had 4 sons well spaced out in age. The Parkers were a very hospitable family who over a long period organised boys' matches for different age groups for the benefit of their sons, their friends, and the village boys. Winton first played for them at the age of about 10. His younger brothers, Martin and Joe, were contemporary with the youngest Parker. In the matches of their age group, Winton sometimes was called upon to umpire. In those days, there was a deep, muddy ditch running round the green inside the boundary. In one of the boys' games, someone hit the ball into the ditch, and Hambledon ran 9 before lost ball was called. The matches were played in a very competitive spirit, watched by half the population of Hambledon, who were not afraid to give tongue at critical moments. The proceedings ended in the convivial relaxation of beer and darts at the Merry Harriers. For away matches, they travelled in a hired coach. In those days, no one in the team possessed a car. On bank holidays, there was an all-day match. This is August 1935, with a marquee for the sale of beer and sometimes a band which played for dancing till long after the sun went down. One remarkable event took place in 1937, a cricket match arranged by Eric Parker between the two Hambledons, ours and the Hampshire village famous for its supremacy in the 18th century. Unhappily, Winton was not able to play, but his grandparents' chauffeur, Monk, drove him over to the Hampshire ground to watch. It was a struggle worthy of the pen of Homer. The Hampshire team reached 143 for 4, but were bundled out after tea for 166. Surrey began badly, made a partial recovery, then collapsed. They were 80 for 7 and, after a brave little stand, 104 for 8, with Eric Parker Jr., a powerful left-hander, going strong. At this point, the captain, Sid Marsh, with a rare stroke of genius, promoted Bert Jeffrey, number 11 on the card, to number 10 and told him to block up one end. He did, while Eric hit the bowling all over the field. A busload of Surrey supporters, who had brought a 9-gallon barrel of beer with them, applauded every run, giving copious and sometimes unprintable advice to each batsman between overs. At 138, Eric was bowled for a gallant 64. Amid awful silence, the last man, Fred Edwards, a fast bowler, went in, while Bert's old father invoked the aid of heaven. And it was found that the ladies were absent-mindedly frequenting the gentlemen's lavatory, sending the gentlemen into the ladies. Fred, who had a good eye, played the natural fast bowler's game and hit out at everything. The bowlers and fielders panicked and began to drop catches. Amid the wildest excitement, 160 went up, and it was announced that the ladies' lavatory had gone irretrievably out of order. The last over was called. The bowler rearranged his field and bowled a fast bouncer. Fred hooked it over the pavilion for 6, tried to do the same with the next ball, which was pitched a little further up, and was comprehensively bowled. The match was adjudged a tie, though the scorers were so confused by the excitement that they announced 3 different results in 10 minutes. Bert, who had obeyed instructions and defended doggedly while 62 runs were scored, seldom hitting the ball more than 5 yards, was left not out 1. At the outbreak of war, Winton's grandfather prepared for gas. His brother Joe joined the local defence volunteers, soon renamed the Home Guard. Bert Jeffrey joined the police. Joe borrowed the single-handed shotgun Bert used for potting rabbits and marched up and down outside the kitchen. Here he is with Fanny Jeffrey, Frisky, Bert, and my mother Thalia. The Hambledon Home Guard devoted much time to securing key locations, such as the Merry Harriers. In the summer of 1940, during the Battle of Britain, they took up station at the top of Haydn's Ball, keeping a lookout for German planes and parachutists and watching the dogfights. There were 2 remarkable cricket matches that summer, as my father recounts in his memoirs. On 15th June, we played Chiddingfold away. This was a few days after the evacuation at Dunkirk. As we got on the bus at Lane End, I remember Bert Jeffrey saying, "France has packed up." It was a marvellous match. Chiddingfold batted first and were bowled out for 75, Bert taking 7 for 31. One of the Chiddingfold players, Soapy Gill, his real name was William, used to play for Hambledon but had moved down the road. He was a left-hander and a tremendous hitter. He took up an aggressive stance and smote what ought to have been a 6, except that the ball shot straight upwards to an appalling height, and I was underneath it. The Chiddingfold players tried to put me off, shouting, "He'll never catch that!" But I did catch it, to my great satisfaction. On 25th of August, at the height of the Battle of Britain, we played Merrow away. While Hambledon were fielding, an air battle broke out high above us. We could hear machine gun fire, but could see little, apart from vapour trails. At this point, the nervous Merrow captain came out and said to Sid Marsh, "Don't you think we should stop?" Sid replied, "Bugger that, we're playing cricket," and we carried on. At the same time, a little man emerged from behind the pavilion and manned an anti-aircraft gun, which we didn't know was there. Hambledon won both matches. On 23rd of October 1940, a heavy bomb demolished Mann's cottage, the former blacksmith's cottage near the village hall, killing the wife and child of the occupier and a refugee couple lodging with them. Their baby was found on the common, yards away, unharmed. The occupant, Leslie Phillips, owner with his brother of the local garage, was on his way back from the pub and found his home no longer there. In April 1941, 2 Heinkel bombers were downed in the neighbourhood, one landing by the pond opposite Busbridge Lakes. Winton saw it the next day as he cycled over to Hambledon from Godalming with Thalia. A week later, he was staying alone at Hambledon when he was woken at around 2 a.m. by gunfire. From the open window, he watched an air battle as a bomber was attacked by a night fighter. The bomber was hit and came down in flames on Gorse Hill, near Lane End. Moments later, there was a tremendous explosion, which knocked Winton backwards. The stricken plane had released a parachute bomb, which landed near the crossroads, blowing out a wall of Hambledon homes, formerly the workhouse. One of the inmates summoned an attendant to complain about the draft. Next morning, Winton collected pieces of the plane and several heavy bomb fragments. Some of the windows at Hambledon Hurst were warped and distorted by the blast and have still not been repaired. In 1932, the Hambledon and Whitley estates were put up for sale by the executors of Mrs. Mary Joycey. Mary Joycey, a widow whose fortune derived from the Newcastle coalfields, had acquired the estates from the Mellish family in 1924, becoming Lady of the Manor. Her son, James John Joycey, a serial bankrupt, was a passionate amateur entomologist who assembled a vast collection of Lepidoptera at his grand house, The Hill, on the top of Wormley Hill. The sale comprised 36 lots, including, in the words of the brochure, 3 attractive residences, The Hill, Woodlands and Roundels, 4 small farms, 22 country cottages, a poultry farm, small holdings, well-timbered woodlands and fine building sites. Winton's grandfather Tommy purchased Lot 27, approximately 150 acres of common land and manorial waste, including Hambledon and Busses Commons, the cricket green and the woodland of Hambledon Hurst. According to a note penciled in a copy of the sales brochure, he paid £825. With it went the lordship of the manor and a black metal trunk stuffed with manor deeds, many with elaborate seals, some written in poor Latin, one or two dating from the reign of Elizabeth I. In addition, there was a large framed map of the manor of Hambledon, dated 1763. The related field book is located in the Wiltshire and Swindon History Centre. The documents revealed a number of strange medieval rights over neighbouring properties, extinguished by Act of Parliament only in the 1920s. When Winton told our genial next-door neighbour, Brodie Hoare, that this included the right of best beast at Michaelmas, he replied, "Which would you prefer, my dog or my wife?" Manor rents had dwindled over the years. In the past, they were often paid in kind, usually 2 fat capons. In 1935, Tommy, as Lord of the Manor, planted an English oak on the upper green at Hambledon to commemorate King George V's Silver Jubilee. It is now a magnificent giant of a tree with wide-spreading, low-hanging boughs. Early photos show cows grazing on the cricket green, with only the square fenced off. Cricket in those days must have presented hazards not faced by players today. Before the First War, geese kept down the grass on the far side of the road, enabling fielders to be placed there, according to Bert Jeffrey. Even in the 1950s, chickens pecked and scratched about the green and sometimes patrolled the outfield during matches. When Tommy died in 1941, his widow Florrie succeeded him as Lady of the Manor. The duties were not onerous, but as she grew older and frailer, her son Harry came to her assistance. To ensure its preservation for all time, they decided to donate the green to the village, not the cricket club, which, however, had first claims on the ground and facilities for their matches. The gift included land on the other side of the road and a magnificent clump of oak trees, where spectators sometimes parked their cars or sheltered from the rain. On August Bank Holiday 1950, in the middle of an all-day match against Thornton Heath, a presentation ceremony took place in front of a large crowd. Harry made a short speech. One small member of the crowd shows a distinct lack of interest. The lady of the manor, now 86, handed the trust deed to the rector, the Reverend A.E. Borthwick, a sporty figure dressed in mufti, one of 3 trustees. The other trustees were Commander McRae, one of the village gentry, and Bert Jeffrey. That's Bert Jeffrey, Commander McRae, Harry, my great-grandmother Florrie, and the rector. In 1950, the old cricket pavilion was in a sadly dilapidated state. The original thatched roof had long been replaced by leaky corrugated iron. Here it is in its pomp in the 1890s. Everyone wore a hat in those days. The changing facilities and the lavatories at the back were inadequate, to say the least. In April, Winton, now captain of the first 11, and other members of the committee resolved that the pavilion should be rebuilt, but funds were wanting. As part of his contribution, Winton wrote a little booklet on the Hambledon Feathercombe matches, with any profits going towards the cost of rebuilding. The profits cannot have been great. Many unsold copies survive to this day. Some are available gratis at the back. It was hoped to enlarge the pavilion and move it to a more central position. The old building stood to one side of the ground between Cricket Green Cottages and Admer's Cottage. Despite all difficulties, the new pavilion, reusing some of the old timbers, rose in its new site and survived for 50 years, until replaced in its turn by a more elaborate structure in 2004. In 1955, Florey paid for Hambledon Village Pond to be restored. Before that, many people were unaware that there had ever been a pond by the shop. It was so overgrown. Florey died in 1956, aged 92, and the following year the Dean family and their cats moved from Milford to Hambledon. Before that, major alterations were undertaken. We divided the big room into a music room and a study, separated by a wall of oak bookshelves on both sides, enlarged the windows to the south, removed the heavy beams which, having been built of half-seasoned timber, had begun to sag ominously under the weight of the concrete floor above, and added an entrance to the study from the front garden. The entire upper floor was renewed in wood. New panelled doors replaced Voysey's rustic originals, and polished oak supplanted some of his green-tiled window lenches. Voysey was entirely out of fashion in 1957. We felt slightly guilty when, years later, students of his architecture asked permission to inspect the house. Today, imitation Voysey houses are springing up all over Surrey. Our move gave Winton, now Lord of the Manor, opportunities for rough shooting over his new demesne, which included the common and much of Hambledon Hurst, stretching to the outskirts of Chiddingfold. If there was little game, there was plenty of vermin, especially grey squirrels, for which in those days the Ministry of Agriculture offered a bounty of 2 shillings a tail. In December 1957, my father organised the first and only shoot over Hambledon Common. His companions were Commander Brodie Hall, our next-door neighbour at Chart Cottage, and Major General J.M. Martin from Great Meadow at Lane End. Jim was a retired Indian Army officer, a late child whose grandfather had been born before the French Revolution. They shot in the afternoon only, bagging 6 jays and a grey squirrel. But there were too many humans about for comfortable shooting, my father noted in his game book. In those days, the woods at Hambledon were swarming with grey squirrels, which had supplanted the reds by the middle of the century. They did great damage to trees, stripping the bark from beeches, not only at the base, but up the stem, sometimes killing the top. Over the years, my father collected a good many tales. A familiar figure, he strode across the green in his cloth cap, his shotgun under his arm, and a pocket full of cartridges. As well as the Hurst, the tall turkey oaks near the shop proved a good hunting ground. Shoppers were occasionally startled by thunderous explosions close at hand, and spent shot shot pattering down like hail. There was a yearly battle with squirrels raiding the walnut trees in the garden, intent on stealing the unripe nuts in their green cases. This must have been successful since we harvested a good many walnuts in those days. Today, the squirrels abscond with every one. Magpies, which rifled the nests of smaller birds and hopped about the garden screeching harshly, were a particular bête noire. My father continued to predate them into extreme old age. On one occasion, he spotted a magpie on the front lawn, stumbled downstairs to collect his gun, ascended the stairs again, and let fly from the bedroom window. Unfortunately, he only winged the bird. Determined to finish it off, he pursued it across the lawn, out the front gate, down the drive, over the road, and across the cricket green. Customers at the shop gaped in disbelief as the shambling figure, in tattered dressing gown, pajamas and bedroom slippers, wielding a 12-bore, lurched ever onwards. Near the far side, he took shaky aim and toppled headlong into the ditch, breaking the stock of his gun. That's it. That's it. Okay.
Which was a bit worrying. He did tend to lay the gun about for it.
What was his employment?
Oh, and he was a music critic and a musicologist, and the world's greatest expert on Handelian opera, and also Bizet. So he was a musician.
Oh, right. So
He was a well-known figure. And his father was also a well-known figure, being Basil Dean, who ran ELSA during the war and did a lot of other things. Tacita is the younger daughter of my father's brother, Joe. Yes. Joe had 3 children, Antigone, Tacita, and Ptolemy. And both Tacita and Ptolemy are quite well known these days.
Have you ever had any filming at your house?
We did have a little bit of filming in 2017 when they did a little of the Howard's End at Hambledon Hurst. But most of it was done at Van, but they did a few days at Hambledon Hurst, and it was all transformed into, the dining room was transformed into an Edwardian drawing room, and various other things happened.
Stephen, can you tell the story about the publishers waiting for your father's second volume of comments and information on Handel's operas, and how patient they had to be?
Yeah, well, they had to be patient, but he did eventually produce the second volume. It came out on his 90th birthday.
How many years after the original deadline?
Oh, only about 25.
Stephen, I wondered, your work on the common, Hambledon Common, that you're doing now, whether you see wildlife, reptiles,
Well, sand lizards are certainly there now, but they were reintroduced. Years ago, there were nightjars which have not returned, but Mr. Boulder at Chart Cottage remembers nightjars there 50, 60 years ago, and sad they've not returned, but they are ground nesting birds, and an awful lot of dog walkers on the commons.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen, for a magnificent and entertaining talk, which we all enjoyed very much.
Oh, good.
Before I just say a few concluding things, I know Ruth told me to say this at the beginning, but I forgot to, so better late. The fire exits are at the back. Yes, okay. There they are. Right, so, yeah, I think I could just conclude by thanking Stephen again. Magnificent and very entertaining. Present here.
Oh.
We'll do that now.
Oh.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yes, John. Sent to you as well. Technical side of things, safe to say we've been completely lost without your help. In fact, we may not have had a presentation at all. So, yeah, I think before we finish, I just would like to reiterate again that we really do need new committee members. I think we've sort of reached a critical point now. So, yes, any new members would be really welcome. Please queue up here afterwards. There's great potential. We really welcome ideas for what to do. We're hoping to have a new bench, perhaps, put up on a